energy, instead of protein, energy here, there was no significant correlation, which tells you again that the energy intake is not relevant as long as it is greater than 100 calories per kilogram. Next slide. Here's one publication where the protein intake was varied and protein retention was measured in nitrogen balance studies. And you see again that there is this positive, strong linear relationship, and you can then read off whatever protein retention you want, and in the fetus we have said it's around 2 to 2.2, and so for that you need about 3.2 grams per kilogram per day. But see, with higher protein intakes you get higher protein retention, in other words, catch-up growth. Next slide, please. Here I've put together all the empirical data that I just showed you some of, and the average, the protein intake needed for fetal growth ranges from 3.0 to 3.3, and for maximum growth that was studied, it goes from 3.4 to 4.2. But these didn't study any higher intakes. But when the intakes were higher, all the way to 4.2, there was an increase in weight gain. That's the beauty of the empirical method. Next slide. That it really tells us what the baby is capable of if given an adequate protein intake. Here is a summary. The factorial method for babies less than 1,200 grams, 4 grams per kilogram. Nothing but an empirical method. No babies were less than 1,200 grams. 1,200 to 2,000 grams, 3.6, as I showed you earlier. The empirical shows somewhat lower values for this, and I think the reason for that is that I used a relatively high rate of non-absorption of protein. I used 17% of the protein intake escapes absorption, and that may be a little bit too high, and so maybe that is value. Both these values are a little bit on the high side because I assumed that babies have more problem with protein absorption than they seem to have in reality, despite of what Dr. New told you about the decreased enzymes that we have and all that. Babies seem to be very efficient in absorbing dietary protein, even intact protein. They break it down, they absorb it. Next slide. Now, for catch-up growth, the factorial method, and I didn't give you any details, suggests that you need to give proteins as high as 4.9 that you get catch-up growth. And in the bigger babies, the empirical data, as I showed you earlier, suggests 4.2 grams will give you catch-up growth. Next slide. So, this is what the neonatologist needs to know about nutrient requirements for preterm infants. The calorie requirement is 105 to 130 calories per kilogram a day. The number of 120 that most of us have in our minds is nothing but an average number. It is not enough for the big babies, and it's more than they need for the small babies. And as I mentioned, 100, if you just keep 100, if the baby gets 100 calories per kilogram, they don't really need more. But what they need more is protein. The protein requirement is 4.0 in the smallest babies, goes down to 3.4 grams per kilogram in the largest babies, and the protein energy ratio is 3.8 in the smallest babies. These are the numbers that you need to know, nothing else. Next slide. The neonatologist also needs to know that most infants are capable of catch-up growth, and that is very well documented in the literature in many, many studies. And it's because babies do need to catch up because we make them not grow in the first week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks. So they need to catch up growth. And to realize catch up growth, infants need 10 to 25% more energy and protein. This is a wide range. All you need to know is that they need more than what I showed you as requirements, and they will catch up. Next slide. What do preterm infants actually receive? There is not much in the literature, but the next slide shows you the grand total in the published literature. And I have arranged it here in chronological order from 1992 to 94, which was the year the babies were born, all the way to 2006. The Carlson and Carlson here is data from our unit. Carlson is our dietitian who keeps meticulous records of babies' intakes and has done so since 1995. So we have records of our babies' calorie intakes and protein intakes and growth going way back to 1995. This here is published. These two Carlson are not published. Everything else is published. And what you see is that at age 4 weeks, the energy intakes, these are the average, for the most part are greater than 100. This is, remember I told you 90 to 100 is probably all the babies need. So I think the energy intakes are okay. But look at the protein intakes. I told you 4 grams per kilogram is what the small babies need. Do you see a 4 here? No. 2.5, 2.6, 2.5. All babies receive too little protein, and that is the reason why they fail to grow. Protein is limiting for growth. Interestingly, things have changed over the years. You see there's a trend to higher protein intakes from the early 90s to the mid 2000s. So things have gotten better. But it's also interesting that at 6 weeks of age, wherever they have looked at 4 and 6 weeks, the protein intakes and the energy intakes are higher at 6 weeks than at 4 weeks. I cannot think of a logical reason why that should be, except that we are a little bit too fearful, I think. Even at 4 weeks, we hold back and we think the baby's GI tract cannot handle too much food, for which I don't think is any factual basis. But the truth is, at 6 weeks, wherever they look, the intakes were higher than at 4 weeks. Next slide. Postnatal growth failure is mainly caused by inadequate protein intake. And I could show you another 20 slides that prove that it's not the energy, but it is the protein. And I once coined the term, it's the protein, stupid. It's the protein that is limiting growth. And if I now asked you what calorie intakes your babies are getting, you will tell me, I'm aiming for 120 calories, right? And usually babies get more. If I asked you what is the protein intake of your babies, who could tell me that? See, that's the problem. That's the problem. You don't know the protein intake. You simply assume that when the calorie intake is adequate, that the protein intake is also adequate. But the truth is, it is not. And that is the problem. That's it's not a simple problem, it's a complicated problem, because to fix it is very difficult. But the intakes of protein are always less than the requirements. And the protein is limiting for growth, and the studies like the one by Olsen et al. Also prove that it's the protein and not the energy. And I show you quickly from the study of Olsen. They looked at dietary intakes and growth in 6 NICU units in New England, and found that the growth velocity ranged from 10.4 to 14.3. This is again from regained birth weight to discharge. So you see immediately, you know that 18 grams would be the fetus. All these babies have growth failure. The average baby grows 10.4 to 14.3. Nutrition explained 53% of the variance in growth velocity. Energy did not explain any, but protein intake predicted increase in growth velocity. For a growth increase of 4.1 grams per kilogram for 1 gram of protein. Very clearly, strongly associated here. So this study is another reason why we can say growth failure is almost always due to inadequate protein intake. More protein will give you more growth, and more protein will give you better brain development. Next slide. Why do we have inadequate protein intake? Because the protein-calorie ratio of most feedings is too low. I told you the formula is 3. For the small babies, it needs to be 3.8, the protein-energy ratio. For fortified breast milk, and I'll show you that in a minute. But we also do things to babies. We tend to have a tendency, if the baby has a gastric residual, we withhold feedings for a period of hours, sometimes days, which is unnecessary and is a contributing factor to the low protein intake. The next slide. Okay, here is the point about the formula. Feedings for preterm infants. The requirement, this is protein to energy ratio, 3.8 to 2.6. This is the number that I showed you earlier. The formulas have a protein energy ratio of 3. So how is that formula supposed to meet the protein energy needs of the 500 grammer and the 1800 grammer? It does not. It gives more protein than necessary to the big baby and too little protein to the small baby. Ignore this over here. This is my thought about how we should have better formulas for the small babies with 3.6, for the larger babies with 2.8. But that's not reality. We don't have those. We have this. And when the babies go home, we have in the United States our post-discharge formulas, which are in protein content 2.8 grams per 100 calories. And I put down here a term formula, which can have as low as 1.8, just as a point of reference. Next slide. The problem is bigger when the baby receives human milk. And at this point, I should perhaps say that, in my opinion, no small baby should receive formula. All small babies should receive human milk. And in our nursery, I can say that, in our nursery, all babies less than 1,500 grams receive human milk of one form or another. If we don't have mother's milk, we have donor milk. I see no place for formula, and the reason for the preference for human milk is that it has a strong protective effect, as I will tell you tomorrow, against necrotizing enterocolitis and against sepsis. And in the new data from the Neonatal Research Network, it even protects against death. Death was significantly higher in babies who did not receive mother's milk compared to those who received mother's milk. It's death. It's not just NEC. It's actual sepsis and death. Now here, the problem of protein for babies receiving fortified human milk. Here is the required intake. I used 3.7. I could have used 3.8. If we take preterm mother's milk at 1 week of lactation, 2 weeks lactation, 3 weeks, 4 weeks lactation, this is the protein energy ratio of preterm mother's milk, which is higher than term mother's milk, as you all know. If we add the fortifier, the Mead-Johnson fortifier or the Ross fortifier, we bring it up to 3.6 in the first week of lactation. But in the second week of lactation, we're down to 3.25. And in the third week of lactation, we're down to 3 or 2.85. And in the fourth week, it goes down, and it goes down. It keeps going down. The problem is that is therefore twofold. The problem of meeting protein requirements of premature infancy has two parts. One is the fortifiers. Both fortifiers are too low in protein by a factor of 2. They should have at least twice as much protein. Then we would get this up to here to about 4.1, which would be about right for the small preemies. And we have the problem, which is not illustrated on this slide, that the protein concentration of mother's milk, expressed mother's milk, is highly variable. Varies from day to day, from pumping to pumping. And how on earth should the neonatologist give the baby an adequate protein intake if he doesn't know the protein content of the milk that he's fortifying? And that is a big problem. I'll talk a little bit about it tomorrow. But until we solve these problems, until we have better formulas, until we have better fortifiers, our babies will continue to receive inadequate protein intakes unless we do something about it. And many nurseries in the United States, I shouldn't say many, but some, do something about it. We add more fortifier. We add, instead of 4 packets, we add 6 packets, which is not a very good way. There should be a better way. Some nurseries add extra protein in addition to the fortifier. And some nurseries do it even to formula. They add extra protein to formula to get the formula, the protein intake up for the small premature baby. So things can be done, but they are difficult to do. They require extra effort and knowledge, and they're not always done. The next slide, please. Oh, I think my time is up. I put this slide. This is my favorite pastime in the cold winter nights in Iowa, and I put it in for Dr. Georgiev, who has played with our group once before. Thank you for your attention.